This is Charles A. Archer, and welcome to our series, The Influencers, where we introduce you to people who in society are affecting change. And today we're speaking to Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Welcome, Hakeem.
Charles, good to be with you.
Thank you very much for being here with us. So we'll just get right into it. Today, through one of my projects, Everybody Paddles, we've been highlighting the influencers. And today you are our influencer. So tell me, being that this is Black History Month, what kind of African Americans have influenced you in your life?
Well, it's an honor and a privilege to serve right now as a member of the United States Congress. And I would say that as someone who's got the opportunity to be a representative in the People's House, individuals like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the legendary Harlem congressperson, was someone who I looked up to when I was in law school and transitioning into a possible career in public service, as well as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who was unbought and unbossed, phenomenal figure, a force of nature, represented many of the communities in Brooklyn, including Bedford-Stuyvesant, that I now have the opportunity to represent. Those were definitely two trailblazers who I continue to look up to and draw inspiration from.
When you think about Brooklyn and you think about the diversity of Brooklyn, what is your take on the diversity that has become the new Brooklyn that we are today?
Well, I'm honored to represent one of the most diverse congressional districts in the country. 33% of the people that I serve were born outside of the United States.
Oh, wow.
So people from all over the world come to Brooklyn and Queens, of course, to experience the American dream. And to live it to the fullest extent possible. And so I represent African Americans, Caribbean Americans, Latinos, South Asians, the Orthodox Jewish community, Russian-speaking Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Turkish Americans, Bangladeshi Americans, Italian Americans. I don't want to leave anybody out.
Exactly.
The list goes on and on. That diversity is tremendous, part of the gorgeous mosaic of Brooklyn. But one of the challenges that we now face is because of the intensity of the affordable housing crisis and socioeconomic gentrification that has taken hold over the last 10, 15 years in Brooklyn and other parts of New York City. That very diversity, the racial, the cultural, the socioeconomic, the artistic, the linguistic diversity is being threatened. And that's a real challenge in terms of New York City continuing to be such a vibrant place.
When we just heard the mayor speak about affordable housing, I'm glad you brought it up. How is Brooklyn going to address that when people appear to be priced out of neighborhoods? Brownstones are going for astronomical amount of pricing. How is Brooklyn, or how are you and other legislators going to be able to address that?
Well, this is an issue that requires an all-hands-on-deck approach. We need people engaged at the city, the state, and the federal level. At the state level, for instance, the rent stabilization laws are up for renewal this year. We've got to protect rent regulation, protect things like Mitchell-Lama housing, and other programs that traditionally have provided affordable housing to working class and middle-income New Yorkers. At the city level, I continue to support the mayor's effort to create or preserve approximately 200,000 units of affordable housing. It's an ambitious plan, but it's an absolutely necessary plan. At the federal level, currently working on legislation designed to strengthen the ability for policymakers to ensure that new projects that come online are at least 50% affordable, and that there's something called income averaging to make sure that the affordability spectrum is as broad as possible. So we can take care of low-income families, working families, and increasingly middle-income families who are finding it difficult to stay in Brooklyn or remain in New York City.
When we think about what's happening in New York City, and I'm going to concentrate obviously only on Brooklyn, there are a lot of developers. We saw the Barclays come. We saw all of the other people come. How are we, or how are you and I and other like-minded individuals going to hold those developers to a different level of accountability, which says affordable housing is a priority? There are other things that they can do in order to not just come to Brooklyn and in so many ways benefit from the brand of Brooklyn, but equally give back.
Well, it's a great question, Charles. And the change in administrations at City Hall is going to be a very important component here. Under the prior two administrations for 20 years, under Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg, what we had was an acceleration of luxury condominium development that took place. It was the steamroller running through neighborhoods like Fort Greene and Clinton Hill and Prospect Heights, parts of Harlem, and other parts of the city of New York, that was unleashed on these communities by the previous two administrations. And so there was not a great deal of leverage in negotiating affordable housing deals with these developers, because City Hall was all about promoting market rate housing. The changing dynamic with Mayor de Blasio in place, someone who understands the need for affordable housing, as opposed to simply handing over the keys to development to people who are determined to build luxury rate market condominiums that can sell for excessive prices and contribute to the gentrification socioeconomically that's taken place all throughout the city. That's a changing of the guard that's very important in terms of our capacity. I think we've already seen it with this administration negotiating better affordable housing deals, such as the one related to the Brooklyn waterfront and the old Domino's factory plant, than had previously been negotiated under the prior administration.
Well, when I think about affordable housing, there's also employment, there's also other economic issues, there are other racial and other things. It behooves me not to talk about those things here with you. How do you give people hope, not just in your district, but in districts surrounding your district, that there are people thinking about them, as well as there's certain things that we want them to do as well?
Well, people have to see change, and the opportunities that get created from different affordable housing projects. It's important to make sure that people in the community within which those affordable units are being built can actually benefit. Because at the end of the day, if you've got folks who are being pushed out by the intensifying prices, and even when an affordable housing project is created, those individuals don't get access to that project, it's problematic. When I was in the state legislature around the Atlantic Yards development, I inserted a provision into one of the bills related to Atlantic Yards to make sure that people within community boards 2, 3, 6, and 8, which means Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Crown Heights, as well as some of the other neighborhoods within those community boards, had access to at least 50% of the affordable units that were created. Good. Because we were of the view that if you had young people with limited income, but who may have come from affluent parents, eligible to apply for these affordable units from all parts of the city, taking up slots that could go to working families who've actually been living in the community, then essentially you're not doing any good. Right. And it's contributing to the loss of hope. And so, the 50% set-aside provision, I think, is important in the context of, giving people hope that we are thinking about those who are being pushed out and doing everything we can to keep them in the community.
And I'll move on to another issue in 1 second, but when we think about Black Brooklyn, when we think about Black Harlem, when we think about Black Chicago and North Carolina, et cetera, in Congress, are you working with your colleagues on how the metropolis of, the cities that are really important to the African American community still maintain that level of authenticity?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because being a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, you see the diversity of where the African American and Caribbean American community are across the country. There are still centers of a lot of activity in and around the urban centers. Right. Chicago has got 3 African American representatives. In New York City, of course, we have 4. But increasingly, after the 1992 elections, there's a rise in African American elected officials from the Deep South. And so we've got an African American representative now from South Carolina, 2 from North Carolina, 1 from Louisiana, 1 from Mississippi, and 3, I believe, in Florida, as well as 2 in the Houston area and 2 in the Dallas area. And so in the South, the broader Deep South, and in the Southwest, there's a rising Congressional Black Caucus membership. And so urban issues will continue to remain at the forefront, but there's an increasing diversity in even the issues that the Congressional Black Caucus now confront, because I've got an entirely urban population. My colleague in South Carolina or Mississippi pretty much has a significantly rural population, along with some areas of the major cities from those parts of the South.
In 1995, a colleague and I started a not-for-profit called Evelyn Douglas Center for Serving People in Need. And we work with the disabled population to help them live with dignity, respect, and independence. When we think about affordable housing, we typically think about able people and people who have the ability and means to do. Is there anything that you're considering or other offices are considering about ensuring that the disabled population, not just veterans or seniors, but intellectual and developmental disabled people are considered in those projects?
Yeah, during my time in the state legislature, I've been consistently behind efforts to create supportive housing for people who are developmentally challenged, physical disability, mental disability, whatever the case may be. Even, in the context of, perhaps having a substance abuse addiction that has been shaken, that illness dealt with, but having to deal with the impact of it moving forward. And that's something that we'll continue to work on. I think that the broadest possible spectrum of affordable housing, municipal workers, seniors, artists, people with disabilities, are going to have to factor in to the effort to keep New York City affordable and diverse.
New York City has done a fantastic job, and thanks to the Office of Disabilities in Manhattan. We just celebrated the 25th anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act, and making sure that, for one, accessibility to the city. Over the last couple of years, there has been some development around yellow taxis that could fit wheelchairs and elevators. How do we get to the point where there's consistent ability to have the disabled population maneuver New York City, and what can we do to improve, with one example being the constant elevators that are not working in the city?
Well, we've made tremendous progress in this area since the historic passage of the ADA, but there's still a long way to go. And one of the challenges, as you point out, is in the transportation infrastructure that currently exists in New York City, and the need to enhance it in a way to allow people with physical challenges to better be able to move around. Even in many subway stations, they're not ADA compliant. And there are stations that are on the list to become ADA compliant. The MTA, in my view, probably hasn't done the best job as to the physical changes. I get that it's costly, but there's been a lot of waste, in some instances fraud and abuse, during the duration of the last 25 years within the MTA, well exposed by city controllers and state controllers, blowing resources that otherwise could be used for things like enhancing subway station ADA compliance. I think at the federal level, we've got to do a better job of continuing to press the MTA, which is the state authority, of improving its capacity. And then, of course, we got to deal with the taxi cab issue as well. EDC Spin is a not-for-profit, and obviously we service communities that you represent and other people throughout the city represent. How important is small businesses and community-based organizations to the fabric of Brooklyn? Well, Brooklyn is often known as the borough of churches, but it's also, in addition, the borough of small businesses.
Yes, it is.
A lot of entrepreneurship, startups, growing sort of tech community as well, but traditional mom and pop shops that are the heart of Brooklyn's economy, the city's economy, and the nation's economy. And these small businesses didn't get the same bailout that the financial companies on Wall Street received because of those institutions' connectivity to collapsing the economy and the need to uphold them in the midst of the Great Recession. But many of us believe that we need to turn our attention to ensuring that the small businesses can be successful, many of whom went out of business or suffered greatly as well as a result of the economic collapse that took place. And it will continue to be an important part of Brooklyn's fabric, because Brooklyn is a borough of neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods, in many instances, are defined by different ethnic groups with different ethnic flavor brought to bear. And that ethnic flavor often manifests itself in the types of small businesses that exist on a given commercial corridor. In Brighton Beach, for instance, which is where I represent, South Asians and Bangladeshi individuals in Ozone Park, another neighborhood that I represent. Caribbean Canarsie, another neighborhood that I represent. It's the small businesses in these neighborhoods that give it a certain flavor and character, and we've got to continue to uphold them.
When you think about the small businesses and you think about Brooklyn as a whole, in my third book, Everybody Paddles, A Leader's Blueprint to Create a Unified Team, we talk about the importance of everybody doing their part. What do you say to your constituents, my neighbors, who don't contribute to society in a way that would absolutely lift everybody up?
Well, one of the things that became clear to many who study the civil rights movement is that it takes teamwork to make the dream work,
right.
and that Dr. King was important, but his partnership with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was important, along with other leaders, John Lewis and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Whitney Young, and the Urban League, Roy Wilkins and the NAACP, and many, many others. And you know, we've made a lot of progress over the last 50 years. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but the continuum of things that occurred from the March on Washington to the 64 Civil Rights Act to the 65 Voting Rights Act took the efforts of a whole lot of folks. Many of them are names that are known to us. Many of those people are anonymous heroes who worked in order to bring to light some of the injustices that took place. And if we're going to continue to make progress, we're going to need a similar level of engagement from people all throughout the community. In ways large and in ways small, everyone can do their part.
When I think about, and it just made me think of one good question about the African American Museum that was supposed to be, or we haven't heard anything recently, developed in Washington. Is that still going to happen? Are we still going to be able to see our history in one place?
Yes, that's in progress. I drive by the site often when I'm in Washington, D.C., and the latest briefing that I've received in connection to its status suggests that it's on track to open within the next year. I hope that's the case, and the Congressional Black Caucus will continue to stand behind the effort and do what's necessary in order to make sure that it gets over the finish line.
I've been referring to you as the people's politician. For lack of a better term, I think that you represent what a new wave of politician looks like and feels like and interacts with what you've been doing. What type of advice would you give to someone interested in politics? We just saw a lot of our friends just get elected into city council and other positions in Brooklyn and in New York. What type of advice would you give someone with some level of interest in politics?
Well, I think identifying your passion from the standpoint of the issues that you want to work on, perhaps in some elected official capacity, but it's important to be able to show the community that you're genuinely interested in change and have some capacity to deliver it before being a candidate for office.
Right.
It doesn't mean that people shouldn't consider running for office at a young age. I first ran at the age of 29, but you should have some connectivity to the community that you hope to represent, and if at all possible, have some evidence that you can genuinely communicate to the people that you want to elect you and that you hope to represent, that if they put their faith in you, you'll have some capacity to work hard to make a difference in their lives.
There was a lot of us who were extremely proud when you came into office, because not that we didn't think the person before you was effective. We just felt that we needed new representation. Is there going to be any level of kind of strategic planning, or what's the word I'm looking for? It's where you're planning for the next generation to come in. Are we going to see any of that within the African American legislative congressional arena?
Yeah, no, well, that's a great question, and I think that the CBC is made up of at least 3 different generations.
Right, exactly.
You've got the legendary generation, as I call it: John Lewis, Charlie Rangel, John Conyers, Maxine Waters, who are all in their 70s and 80s and have done a great job and are still actively engaged. But they'll tell you themselves that they're in various stages of transition. Charlie Rangel, for instance, has said this is his last term. And I think that it will continue to be important, for the CBC to help others along, get involved in public services at all levels of government, and to certainly facilitate the transition through the democratic process. In making sure that our communities can continue to be effectively represented. Now, at the end of the day, one thing I will say about the CBC I found is that whenever someone becomes part of the CBC, even if it's not a candidate that different CBC members in their part of the country may have supported, that it's a family where you get embraced, and they want to see you succeed because they understand that if you succeed, it helps the CBC, the House Democratic Caucus, and the country to succeed as well.
It's a lot about representation. I know you're busy, so we'll get to probably maybe 2 or 3 more questions. When we think about representation, there are a lot of committee structures in New York City that don't look like the diversity. We can talk about the police department, but we've heard that there are some things that people are considered doing. I'm thinking more of on the level of not just philanthropic dollars, but also the MTA committees, also community boards. How do we get more representation in those places where decisions are being made, but they're also affecting people that are really not participating?
Well, I think one of the great things in terms of what's happened with the renaissance of certain neighborhoods in Harlem and Brooklyn is that a lot of young professionals who at one point would have been expected to move out of the city as a sign of progress and move to the suburbs have remained within the city and helped to revitalize different inner city communities. I think the next stage and what has taken place is making sure that we get these young professionals involved at different levels of civic engagement, whether that's a community board, whether that's a precinct council, whether that's as an appointed representative at different levels of government. There are various organizations. I think the Council of Urban Professionals has done a good job of trying to match individuals, talented people who are willing to get civically engaged with opportunities, and we need to continue to do more of that.
When is there any initiatives that we should be listening for or expecting to come out of your office?
Well, during my first term in the House, I was appointed to a bipartisan task force on overcriminalization, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, looking at overcriminalization in America, particularly for many of us, the failed war on drugs and what that has meant in terms of channeling people from a pipeline that took them from the schoolhouse to the jailhouse with great adverse consequence for communities of color. And I'm actually optimistic, notwithstanding the fact that both sides of Congress right now are Republican controlled, that there's an emerging bipartisan consensus to deal with mass incarceration, the failed war on drugs, to start to try and channel people who may be substance abusers out of the prison system into drug treatment, to reduce mandatory minimums, to create more judicial discretion, to further roll back the distinction between powder and crack cocaine that has no pharmacological justification and was 100 to 1 at one point, is now 18 to 1, that we actually are in a position to get some things done in this area, and that there are a lot of voices in the Republican House, the Republican Congress, and amongst conservative activists on the outside, whether that's Newt Gingrich or the Heritage Foundation, who are now prepared to come to the table and work in a bipartisan way across ideological lines to significantly reform the criminal justice system. Okay. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time on that issue over the next term.
You have been on, or you are on, a couple of really big committees. And without going into grave detail, what's next for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries?
Well, on the Judiciary Committee side, criminal justice reform will be big, as I mentioned, dealing with civil rights. 50 years later, the Supreme Court has rolled back the historic Voting Rights Act in a way that threatens the ability of many Americans to participate in such a fundamental aspect of our democracy. We're going to be working on that issue. I'm also excited to serve on judiciary because it's got jurisdiction over the internet.
Right.
And so I've been working closely in the innovation and technology economy space to see if we can make sure that our young people can get access to the type of jobs that will be available to them as coders and as engineers and as people who don't just use apps and games but can create apps and games.
Right.
And there's a real opportunity to prepare our young people for the 21st century economy in this way. And, sitting on judiciary with jurisdiction over the internet, but also sitting on the Education and Workforce Committee with jurisdiction, over the educational space provides for a nice opportunity to work together to hopefully open up open up these jobs and the training and the education required to get these jobs for young people in Brooklyn and in Queens.
Last question, and you can avoid it if you want to, but it's definitely about the presidential election. Are we looking at seeing Hillary, or are we looking at seeing someone else?
Well, I think that it appears that Hillary Clinton is a likely candidate. She's also been rumored to be considering Brooklyn as her campaign headquarters.
Wow.
I think Brooklyn is ready for Hillary Clinton if Hillary Clinton is ready for us,
right, in
terms of situating herself here. If she were to run, I think she'd probably clear the field of all the major candidates. If she doesn't run, then I think we could see anyone from Vice President Biden to Governor Cuomo to others occupy that space. But the more time that passes, the more likely it is that we'll see Hillary Clinton jump into this race.
It's funny because no matter how many times I talk to you, there's an answer that you give that gives me another question. When I think about the fact, the possibility of a woman, we've just saw Barack Obama, first historical African-American to be elected to the presidency, the possibility of a woman. Do we anticipate the possibility of a Latino? Do we anticipate the possibility of anybody else reaching the highest office in land, or another African-American at some point?
Well, I certainly think that, over the next few presidential cycles, you're going to continue to see groundbreaking presidential candidates. Certainly, Hillary Clinton would be a tremendous candidate, man or woman. She's one of the most experienced presidential candidates, were she to enter in history. Having served as a United States Senator, a First Lady, and a Secretary of State, and done a great job in all three capacities. But we also, at some point, are likely to see a future African-American run, probably more likely to see a Latino run, either a Latino governor, former Latino senator, current Latino senator run for that office at some point on either the Democratic or the Republican side. And I think it's a sign of the growing diversity of this country.
Well, good. Thank you very much for your time.
Right.
I appreciate it.
That's
good.